Okay, tonight we're starting the book of 1 Peter. Now, I need to make an explanation because when I say that to the class here, they're going to say, what do you mean? We had a class last week. And so let me explain so that everybody will know what I'm getting ready to do right here and explain why I'm just going to do a halfway job in certain things. Last week, the tape didn't show up. It didn't turn out. And so we've got to either say, okay, shall I go back and redo what I did last week? And I might say this, that for the benefit of the people to be listening to the tape, that we took a full hour last week in just talking about Peter. And so if I did that, it would put all of you in great mental anguish of sitting there and listening to me say the same thing that I did this last week. However, if I don't and just go ahead with the text as we're getting ready to get into it tonight, then the people that's listening to tape is going to miss something that on Peter that I think really is very important for them to get. And another thing is that I'll probably say something about last week, and then the people who are listening on tape will say, no, this is the first week. Like Dan said, then phone calls are going to come in to him, hey, what happened to the first class and so forth. So I just want to explain it to you that we've had the first class last week, a full hour on Peter, but in order to put the information on tape, I'm going to go back and review that, but I'm not going to take the hour to do it. We're going to go through it very, very rapidly, and I think that if we had the full hour, why, we could talk about a lot of those personal things that are very, very interesting about Peter that we'll not have time to take up tonight. So hope that illustrates and tells you why I'm going to go back and start talking about some of these things. We're going to be going through it pretty rapidly here tonight. So we started out, let's get acquainted with Peter the man. What kind of individual was Peter? Now, here we have a picture of Peter's house. And you say, how do you know it's his house? Well, this is a picture of where the archaeologists believe, with good reason, it is Peter's house. It's one of those things over there that they say pretty sure that this is it. It's been identified as a first century house. It wasn't built before, it wasn't built after, it's built there in the first century. And then when they started excavating it, they actually found inscribed in the plaster, this was Peter's house. Who put it there, I don't know, but it was put there hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And then in Mark 1:20, it does give us a little location in that it says, and straightway they came out of the synagogue and they came into the house of Simon. So his house was real close to the synagogue. Now, there is his house. If you're standing over on the synagogue and you take a picture of his house, that's how close it is. So you can see he just came out and he went in there. Now, put this picture up here to let you know. You say, boy, that looks like quite a house. Well, that structure that you see is not his house. That is a church building that was built 300, 400, 500 years after Christ lived. Peter's house is underneath there. It's underneath the ruins like you see these other ruins that are in there. But in Israel, in places like this, why generally people over the years have gone in, they build a church building, and when they say a church building, it really is not a church building the way we would think of it. It's just a great big building to celebrate and protect a certain site. And so his house is underneath there. So as you look at it, you can see the beams are in there and the floor of the church building that's there. Peter's house is down underneath that. So you'd look down, you'd see a room in there with a rounded wall. You kind of see again here where they have it there. You can see going through a door where everything was made of rock over there, still is. Very thick walls that they had. And it's be the last picture. This is one of the rooms that are back there. So that may be the room that his mother-in-law was sick in when he went in and he healed her and so forth. But somewhere in that house, it's kind of interesting to look at it in that way there. Now, if you're standing in Peter's house and you're looking at the synagogue, well, there is the synagogue, see? And so it is in the right location in there. Well, just threw that in. has no biblical significance whatsoever, but it's kind of an interesting thing to see. An actual man lived in that house that's there. And you kind of look, and what I want us to see is Peter was just an actual man. He was just a regular individual. And see what happened to him. Now, as we see, Peter was a fisherman. We learned this. It said, and walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brethren, that is Christ, Simon who's called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. This is put up there, so you can see that net, kind of an interesting thing. That's the way that they fished. They don't fish with a hook and so forth. Sometimes they do, but that's not the normal way when you're fishing to make a living. So they take this net, and it's a big round net. They throw it out like a lasso. It goes out, it's weighted down, it sinks down. Then they pull on a rope that closes it up and pull it in to see what kind of fish that they have in there. Kind of helps us understand later when Jesus called Peter and Andrew, why he called them, and he promised them, make them fishers of men. He said, come and follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men then. Now, this is the kind of fish that is found up where Peter lived. It's called Peter's fish over there today. There's three kinds of fish, as you can see in there. The mush that grows up to 15 inches and up to 3 pounds. It's kind of interesting. When we were over there, there's a restaurant there, and so they, of course, sell Peter's fish. And I couldn't leave without eating Peter's fish. I think you did too, didn't you, Steve? And people there would say, well, let's try it, let's eat Peter's fish. And our fish wasn't nearly that big. They're kind of like a small crappie or a small bluegill, maybe that long, and I could eat 2 or 3 of them without any problem that is there. So they don't have these great big 3-pounders. It's like that. But there's the kind of fish that they catch over there. Then they have another smaller fish, a biny, that they use for feast and banquets. It's kind of an eloquent fish. And then they have the sardines, which are real small fish, and they dry them and pickle them and so forth. So you're looking at the kind of fish there that you have. The reason that bread is back there is because this is just an illustration that these probably, I think without doubt, are the kind of fish that that Jesus would have used in taking the bread and the loaves and the fish and fed the 5,000 people by them. And so it would be kind of in that way. Now, we talked about Peter's family real quickly. Peter was a married man. The reason we know it was because in one passage it says his mother-in-law was sick in his house. Jesus came in and healed her. Then Paul stated that he was married in 1 Corinthians 9:5. He said that he had a wife, and he tells us that his wife accompanied Peter as he was traveling around and he was preaching. Now, Peter also had children. The way we'd come to that conclusion is he served as an elder in addition to being apostle. According to 1 Peter 5:1, he said he was an elder. And, of course, in order to be an elder, then you had to have some children. Now, Peter had a brother named Andrew that we've already talked about, and we've seen that he had that. Now, Peter's first encounter with Jesus, the way that happened is kind of interesting, and that's what I mean. If we had time to go into it, you can kind of set the stage, and you can see how interesting it really is. But here you have Jesus has been baptized by John down the Jordan River. Then he went away into the wilderness for 40 days. When he came back, John is still down there, and John has 2 disciples, and one of them was Andrew, Peter's brother. And so they looked up, and here comes this stranger. And John the Baptist looked out and sees him, and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God." And so he introduced Jesus as the Lamb of God to these people. Well, Andrew and his friend, who were down there with John the Baptist, they then followed Jesus. When Jesus left, they followed him. And a little while, Jesus saw that they were following. He turned around and he said, Why are you following me? And they said, "We'd like to know where you live." He said, "Well, come with me and I'll show you." And so he went with them, went home with them then. Well, Andrew was so excited, he ran and got Peter, his brother, and brought him to introduce him to Jesus then. And so when he came up to introduce him to Jesus, Jesus looked at him and told him what his name was, and then he changed his name from Cephas. His name was actually Cephas, but I'm going to change it to Peter, really, is what it is going to be here. It was Simon, and he's going to change it to Cephas, which is Hebrew, or Peter in Greek. Now, his brother introduced him there, so he changed his first name then to Cephas, Hebrew, or Peter in Greek. Now, this name change will become significant when you study later on in other books then. For instance, in Matthew, the 16th chapter, it's a very significant thing, and I want to point this out to you. That here is the Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus went up and where Peter made that great confession. So here's Caesarea Philippi. And as you can see, there is this great big cliff, and in that big black hole, there is a river that is gushing out. And right there at the head of that river, the people had built a temple to the god Pan. That means the god of everything. And this god Pan, he was known for his immorality. Of all the immoral things you could do, he was noted for that. So they have stories about him and Hercules, and they got together one day and they tried to see who could drink the most, and Hercules was of course a lot tougher than Pan, but Pan drank him under the table, and Pan was a great drinker and a sod and all of that. But this is the kind of gods that they had. See, these were their mythological gods that they had there. Then they had Herod had built a temple right here. So there's a temple there that he had built in honor of the Caesar sitting there, and over here was another one to Zeus. So now, I want you to imagine now, as you're coming up, there's what you would see, these great gigantic buildings. Now we're told that Herod's temple that he built was made out of solid white marble, and it was glistening, you see, in the sun. It was really an impressive situation. So Jesus then took his disciples, his 12 apostles, and he walked up there. Now it's kind of interesting when you're studying the Gospels. He walked about 32 miles to go up there. And all that you find out he did when he got there was this one thing that I'm going to tell you about. Then he turned around and walked this 32 miles back home again. So he walks up there, and they came up, they're looking at this thing, and Jesus then turns to his disciples and says, "Who do you say that I am?" Here now you have choices of all these great gods that they built this to. That is where Peter said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Then, here's where the name comes in. Jesus looked at him and he says, "Thou art Peter." That's Petros. Thou art Peter. But upon this rock, and that word in Greek is Petra, upon this rock I'll build my church. Now the difference in the meaning is that Petros generally defines a detached rock. It would be the rocks like when you're going to Leavenworth and you see all these rock slides, great big gigantic cliffs that are up there, and all of a sudden rock slide. You look over and here are the rocks that have slid down. Some the size of an automobile, some the size of a baseball, some the size of your little finger. That would be Petros. Then you look at that great cliff, and that is Petra. Now Jesus is making a distinction. He said, "Peter, you are as hard as a rock. I've named you Rock. You are like one of these rocks. But upon this gigantic cliff," now what would that have been? The only other thing in the context is his confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now upon this confession, upon this Petra, I will build my church. It'll be built on the fact I am the Son of God. Then they turned around and went on back. And so you can kind of see there a significance in the change of names there. Now, Peter had a unique relationship with Jesus. He was one of 3 men that were chosen to witness certain things. The raising of Jairus' daughter. Here's a man, ruler of the synagogue. His daughter was sick. He came to get Jesus to heal him. Jesus is going back. The people come and say, "The little girl is dead. She's died." So they got to the house, and everybody around there is mourning and crying. And Jesus said, "Well, she's just sleeping." So then they started laughing at him. He then turned around and took Mom and Dad and Peter, James, and John and said, "You come with me." They went in the bedroom. he reached down, took her hand, and said, "Tabitha, arise." And she got up. He looked around at Mom and Dad and said, "Give her something to eat," and walked back out. Now, Peter was one of the three that got to witness that, the transfiguration. Remember that great thing that went up and he was transfigured up there? And that's where God then told Peter, James, and John, "This is my beloved Son. Hear ye him." And really made an impression on him up there. Peter will make reference to that a little bit later on. So maybe I ought to kind of refresh our mind just a little bit more. Peter, James, and John goes up there with Jesus. They get up there and they see a man, Moses was over there. And so all of a sudden, Jesus is transfigured. He just changed, so he just absolutely, totally pure white. It says whiter than anything that you can do to get a person white. And so he's there, and Peter starts mumbling about what they should do and so forth. A cloud came down and then raised up. Peter had said, "Lord, let us make you a tabernacle, and one over here to Moses, one over here." And so the cloud raised up, and then they heard the word, "This is my beloved Son. You listen to him." Wow. Peter never forgot that. And Peter's going to make reference to that in this book and tell you, and he's going to use it in a very powerful way. Very, very powerful way. Now, Peter, James, and John, they were the three that got to go with Jesus in the garden. All the 12 went with Jesus to the garden. They got up to the garden, then Jesus told everybody, "Stay here. Peter, James, and John, you come with me." They went just a little farther on. Jesus said, "I'm so sad, I'm so sorry, I could die." He said, "You guys stay here. I'm going to go up here." So he went a little farther, and he bowed down and he prayed. And that's where he prayed for 3 hours. He came back 3 times, but he prayed for 3 hours. "Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but thy will be done." And so Peter, James, and John got to experience that then. Peter was a man of action. Getting into his personality now. He was the first to answer the Lord's questions. When the Lord had asked a question, bing! Peter was always the one that came out with that answer. Sometimes he came out real good ones, sometimes with not so good ones. In Matthew chapter 16 verse 17, when Jesus said, Who do you say that I am? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he gave him a good answer. In John 6:68, he gave him a good answer. But he was a first. He was a man of action. He immediately wanted to walk on water. This is one of those things. He saw Jesus out there in the middle of the night, about 3 o'clock in the morning. They were scared to death. They thought he was a spirit. Jesus identified himself as Jesus. And then Peter just yells out like, Lord, let me walk on the water. And he said, come on, come. Peter jumped out of that boat. Now, would you have done that? See, kind of think about what the kind of guy that Peter was. Everybody else was in there. Nobody else said anything like that. But now Peter wanted to walk on water, so he got out and he went out, and he was the first one then to walk on the water. He was the first one to dart into the tomb. He and John ran to the tomb. John outran him, but John stopped. John didn't want to go into that tomb by himself. But when Peter got there, zoom, right past John and on in to the tomb. He was the first to confess Jesus to be the Christ. But he was the first to correct Jesus immediately afterwards too. You don't know really what Peter's going to do, but one thing you know, he's going to be first. He's going to be the one that steps up and bing, and he's going to have those answers that are out there. Now the point that we wanted to make, and here's what I want us to appreciate with Peter is, our Lord chose this man of action to be the first to proclaim the gospel to a hostile Jewish nation and to open the doors of the kingdom of God to the world. Peter had the personality, the characteristics. At this time, he's uncultured, he's unsophisticated, he's uneducated. He gets himself into a lot of trouble. He can't be trusted at this particular time, but he has those qualities that are needed. So after Jesus gets through developing Peter, later on, he's going to need somebody to stand out on the day of Pentecost and preach to those thousands of people who have just crucified Jesus Christ. Now that takes nerve, it takes courage. And on that day, here it is, you have all the 12 that are there speaking in tongues, and Peter said, "Men of Israel, give ear unto me, listen to me." Peter started preaching. He preached the first sermon to those hostile Jews. Now, we say that 3,000 of them obeyed the gospel, of which they did, but how many didn't obey the gospel, see, of the hostile that was there? And so it takes a man of action, and that's the kind of individual that Peter really was. Now, Peter was a man of extremes and contradictions. He often acted and then without thinking about the consequences. For instance, in Mark 16:16, he confessed Jesus. "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah." They turned around to leave, to go back home. Right as they were heading out, Jesus says, "Now we're going to go back to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be killed. They're going to deliver me up, and I'm going to be killed." Peter jumped in, "Not so, Lord, it will not be this," and he started to rebuke Jesus in there. So he's a man of action, and he really doesn't realize the consequences. That's where Jesus turned around and says, "You get behind me, Satan." See? It's there. He walked on water one minute, and he sank the next minute. Lost his faith. It was there. He had the courage for Jesus to fight 1 minute, then deny him the next. Remember when the soldiers came out and they got Jesus? Peter was the only one with a sword. He pulled that sword. He went in there, and he's fighting all of those Roman soldiers, whacking away with that sword. Cut off Malchus's ear. He was ready to fight, and so he was a man of action. Jesus healed his ear, told Peter to put up the sword, but later on that night he turned around and denied Jesus. And so you see a man that was acting, but he didn't look ahead to see the consequences on so many of these things. Then later that night there, he had said, he asserted he's willing to die for Jesus and will remain faithful even if all the rest forsake him. Now put yourself in that situation. Suppose that there's 12 guys up here, and Jesus is talking to them. Let's just suppose that I'm talking to them. We've got 12 men, and I turn around and I tell these men, I say, now, you guys are not going to remain faithful. And Oliver's standing there. And Oliver jumps out, "Lowell, I will be faithful even if it costs me my death. I will be faithful even if these other guys are not." That's a pretty dogmatic statement, isn't it? See? You can imagine how Oliver would feel if all of a sudden he turns out to be the guy that is the first one to turn and deny Jesus. But that's what you find with Peter. He preached salvation to both Jew and Gentile in Acts 2:39. Then it required him a miracle to get him to go preach in Acts 10. He preached the equality of the Jew and the Gentile. Then all of a sudden he started practicing the wrong thing, different thing in Antioch. And Peter and Paul had to rebuke him. So he's a man of extremes, a man of opposites. I want us to think about Peter. I want us to see these characteristics in him. He's a man that got himself in a lot of trouble, see? And so oftentimes we look at the apostles and we think, boy, they were something, a little better than a human, a little under an angel, a little better than a human. No, Peter was a man that was always getting himself in trouble. He had to act. He's always the first guy to get in there and act. And then he would find later on that he'd get himself in trouble. But we want to understand there's a place for this. It's interesting, when you read the Bible doesn't cover up any of these weaknesses that he has. But it should be noted that when Jesus got through with Peter, and you have the finished product, he was a man that glorified God. Acts 4:13 is a very powerful verse that we all ought to remember. Peter and John have preached, and they have been arrested, and they have been brought up before the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court, and they've been given command not to preach in the name of Jesus. And they've told them, whether we obey God or man, you judge. The Supreme Court was wondering, what gives these men the ability to conduct themselves with such confidence and bravery in the eyes of a Supreme Court? Try to put yourself in the Supreme Court of the United States, and you go in, and you're going to have to answer yourself. You don't have an attorney up there like we do now that stands between you. But you're going to have to answer for yourself. And you go up that Supreme Court, and they tell you, they tell you whatever it is that you've lost. Don't you ever do that again. How would you feel? How would you feel? Would you have the courage to do what they did and say, well, since you are judges, whether we ought to obey God or man, you be the judge? The Supreme Court was wondering what gave them such confidence as they were sitting at the foot of such power. And it says they took knowledge that they had been with Jesus. If you spend time with Jesus and you eat His Word, people are going to see you have been with Jesus. And so it showed up in Peter. Now, Peter had some embarrassing moments that prepared him to serve as an apostle. Real quickly. When he was out there walking on that water, he looked down, and all of a sudden he lost his faith, and he started to sink. When Jesus looked down and grabbed him and pulled him up and said, "Oh, ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" Can't you just see the skin crawling on his neck? How ashamed he must have been to have that. Excuse me. When he in all of his bravery turned around to rebuke Jesus, he wasn't a coward. He turned, "Jesus, that's not the way it's going to be." He's acting a part of a brave man. And Jesus looked at him and said, "You get behind me, Satan." Whew. Take the starch right out of you. And then Jesus had told him, "Before the cock crow here, thou shalt deny me thrice." Now that was in the, what I want you to see is that's when, a little while ago when I used Oliver up here, it's an example. Here it is, you have these 12. Jesus says, that some of you are going to flee from me. Peter made that statement. "I'll never do it. I'll die. If these other guys may, but I'll not." And then Jesus looked at him and says, "Peter, before the cock crows in the morning, you will have denied me 3 times. How embarrassing that must have been to have that accusation thrown at you. And then here, one of the most touching things I can think about that a human being would face. Peter has denied him the next morning, and as soon as he denied him the 3rd time, the cock crew. And when the cock crew, it said, "And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter." And if you could just imagine the humiliation he had after he had made all those braggadocious statements earlier in the evening. And now then, it's coming around in the morning, somewhere, I suppose around 6 o'clock in the morning. And he has denied Jesus 3 times, and he's standing out there, and he's caught up in the adversarial position of them saying, "You know him, no I don't." And so the 3rd time, "No I don't." And the cock crew, and Jesus is sitting up on his chair, and he turned and looked at Peter. How would you feel? I can't imagine. Jesus then had Peter to confess 3 times that he loved him. We'll not have time to go into it. Now, Peter, an apostle of Christ. Peter was given the keys of the kingdom. He proclaimed the first sermon. He did it before thousands of those enemies. He was the major figure in the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts. His task was to especially preach to Jews. However, he did also preach to Gentiles in that. Now, Peter's death. Peter's death, Jesus prophesied and told him what kind of death he was going to die. Peter and Jesus were walking along by themselves, and Jesus said, Peter, when you were young, you put on whatever clothes you wanted to put on, and you went wherever you wanted to go. But when you get old, some other people are going to put on the clothes you don't want, and they're going to take you where you don't want to go. And it says he spoke about the kind of death that Peter was going to die. So it's going to show him that he was going to be killed. He was going to die a violent death. Now, in harmony with the characteristic of Peter, see, they walking along, Peter looked back and saw John following him. And Peter said, Lord, what's going to happen to him? And that's where Jesus said, it's none of your business, Peter. You just follow me. What he said was, if I want him to live until I come back again, is that any business of yours? And but again, you can see Peter's characteristic coming out. That's there. There was a rumor then that went around that John wasn't going to die, but you read it and it's an untrue rumor. Now, later on in this epistle, Peter's going to refer to this. And he's going to tell them, he said, here's the reason I'm writing this epistle here, or in the 2 Peter. For this reason, I will not be negligent to remind you always of these things, though you know and are established in the present truth. Yes, I think it right, as long as I am in this tent, that's his body, to stir you up by reminding you, knowing that shortly I must put off my tent, just as our Lord Jesus Christ showed me. So Peter says, I know it won't be long that I'll be killed the way my Lord told me that I was going to be killed. And so he tells why he's speaking to these people, and that is to remind you people of the things really that you already know. Don't let it forget you. Then we talked about this, that there's a tradition. We don't know whether it's true or not. Probably not true as far as historians think, but it's said that he was finally went over to Rome, and they were going to crucify him, and he asked to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to die like his Lord died. So whether that's true or not, but evidently Peter was crucified or something in a very violent way. So you look at Peter, the man. He's the kind of man that Jesus needed for the job that he had to do. Kind of man that he was needed there. So now, let's get acquainted with the epistle. So we start out with 1 John in here. So the epistle itself, as we look at it, to whom was it written? It's very plain. He says he's writing to the dispersion, that'd be the dispersion of the Jews, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Now, what we mean by the dispersion would be this. The Jews, for most of their life, had lived in the land of Palestine or Israel or the land of Canaan. But as time goes on, especially under the Roman government and so forth, for various reasons, many of them had dispersed out into the other lands. They'd gone out into the Gentile lands and were living in there. So he's writing to these Jews that are up in Pontus and Galatia and Cappadocia and Asia, up in the northern part of the area. So he says he's writing to those people, those Jews who are up there. Now, he also writes to the Gentiles. And so I know that because in 1 Peter 1:14, you might just look over there because we're trying to figure out, to whom was this letter written? Now, Peter says he's writing it to the dispersion there. But in 1:14, he talks to these people and he says, now as children of obedience, not fashioning yourselves according to your formal lust in the times of your ignorance. That's not how you talk to a Jew. They might have been sinners, but they knew what they were doing. They knew the Word of God. So he's talking here to Gentiles in this particular verse. You Gentiles, You straighten up your life. And then again, over in 2:10, he says, writing, he says, who in time past were no people, but now are the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Now we'll learn that this is a prophecy about the Gentiles, how the Gentiles were not the people of God, they had not obtained the mercy of God, but now under Christ they are the people of God. So it shows he's writing to them. In chapter 4 and in verse 3, for the time past may suffice to have wrought the desires of the Gentiles and to have walked in. So I said, now, the times past may have sufficed for you to have done all these things. But that time is over. It's time now for you to start living a certain way. So to whom is the epistle written? Peter says, I'm writing it to the dispersion of the Jews. So primarily it's that. But he also makes some statements to the Gentile Christians who are there. This is not unusual because Peter was an epistle, he was an apostle to the Jews, but did he ever preach to the Gentiles? He's the first one to preach to the Gentiles, yeah. The apostle Paul was an apostle to the Gentiles, but did he ever preach to Jews? Yeah, he preached to Jews, see? And so if I said now, Sunday morning, I'm going to be preaching to the women of the congregation. Suppose that in my sermon to the women, here it is and here it is, and I turn around and I say, now you men, you need to understand this about your wives. Now have I told a lie? Or do I have the privilege of sometimes then speaking to a man when I'm talking primarily to the women, see? So we know that that's who the recipients are of this epistle then. Now, where was he when he wrote it? Well, he's down at the end, he's specifically going to mention Babylon. He said, they of Babylon salute you. Now, when you look at Babylon, Babylon was a major city of Assyria. Babylon is over where Baghdad is today. Up that same spot, really, is where Babylon was located, up in Assyria. Now, there was a small town down in Egypt, also known as Babylon, and but most people say it was so small and insignificant, and I don't know how large it was, but they say it's so small that it probably wasn't worthy of being named. You know, it's kind of like if we were writing a letter to a national audience and we mentioned somebody in Clearwater, did something like this, or Clearview, and so on. And then Rome is figuratively called Babylon in Revelation, but at that time it wasn't. So probably, you just take it literally speaking, that Peter had gone up to Babylon in Assyria, and he was preaching up there in that area. Now the time of writing. He gives us very little to go on, but we know that his death is not far away. See? We know that, and you put kind of two and two together, and we know that Jerusalem hadn't been destroyed yet. He's going to make some statements. It's not going to be long until it will be. There's going to be some persecution come. And so it's generally thought to be somewhere 66, 67, 68, in the late 60s is probably when Peter wrote this. Of course, it's not important for us to know, except to know it's in the later part of the period of time before Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, the purpose of writing. The purpose of writing is very interesting. The one word that you want to remember about 1 Peter is hope. It is the epistle of hope. He's going to be talking about that a lot. Going to be talking about that hope that he has. And that's what makes this epistle thrilling to me, is to see why he tells us about that hope that he has. Here's a man that has suffered for Christ immensely. Here's a man that was a fisherman, an ignorant fisherman. They're accused of that in Acts 2. But here's a man that has arisen to a high, what am I looking for? High, prominent position in the world. Now, the world doesn't know it. The world doesn't know it. But here's a man that is taking the gospel of Jesus Christ out into the world. Here's a man that Jesus Christ has chosen to be one of his 12 ambassadors to take this gospel out into the whole world. So he's going from that lowly, crude fisherman that got himself in all kind of trouble to a man now, some years later, down in the elderly years of his life, to a man now that has come to grow, and he has this hope. He knows he's getting ready to die a violent death, but he has this hope. It's the epistle of hope. Now, when you think of John, you think of love. John talks about love. Peter's central theme is hope. And he goes ahead to tell you now about this hope. The central idea is to endure. Just keep on keeping on because of the hope that is out there before you. So that's really what we're going to learn about there. Now, the composition of writing. What do we have in the composition? Well, doctrine. The doctrine is discussed in from 1:1 down to chapter 2, verse 10. He's going to be teaching in the doctrinal sense. Then he's going to change to practice, practical things. Now then, since you have this hope, since there's this hope in heaven that's reserved for you, now here's the kind of people that you ought to be. You do this, and you do this, and you do this. And so it's going to be broken down into that realm then. Okay, with that, we're ready to go to the text and start out with the salutation or the introduction. And I want to take a word-by-word study. So if you turn to 1 Peter chapter 1, you look at the introduction or the salutation. Now, anytime that you look at the salutation, you think, well, it doesn't contain very much. Let's get with it, get on, and we'll go ahead. In fact, if I read it, then you can judge to yourself really how much you get out of it. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the elect who are sojourners of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ, grace to you and peace be multiplied. Was all that clear? Where you say, oh yeah, I understood everything about it. Velma's back there grinning because she knows if she says yes, I'm going to ask her, well, what does that sanctification by the Spirit mean? You see, that's something there. Now, we're going to look at word by word as we go through this. So the words in the introduction, every one of them is really important. First of all, Peter. Peter uses the name given to him by Jesus at their first meeting that we just got through talking about. Then he says, an apostle. All right, now the word apostle means one sent forth. That's what it means, one sent forth. The word apostle comes from two Greek words. The apo means forth, and the stello part means I send you out. So if I were to ask Steve, would you go out in my car right now and get me that book in the back seat? Steve gets up and goes. Somebody comes in, they say, where's Steve? I say, well, he's my apostle. See? I could say that. He's not the apostle of Christ, but he's my apostle because I sent him forth on a job. So that's really what it means. Now, these apostles were the apostles of Christ, and Christ chose 12 of them. Now, if we had time, we could stop tonight. We don't have time since I had to repeat everything that I said last week, but we can stop tonight and say, let's take a look at these 12. Let's look at them. Now, we've looked at Peter, and we've seen the character that he has. And we've seen how he had that character so that the Lord could mold him and mold him into a rock so that he would be a giant among men, so that he would stand firm in the face of all kind of hostilities. And before thousands of Jews, he was a solid rock when the Lord got through talking about him. Now, you turn to the others, and Jesus didn't just go out and say, hey, any 12 men out there, come and follow me. He went by and he picked them out. And he picked out James and John there. Now, Am I hearing a... Oh, okay. I didn't know really what I was hearing right in there. I thought maybe it was a policeman there to start with. I was getting ready to run. Okay, now James and John. Now when you think about John, what do you think about? What's the word? John is what? Love. Yeah, everybody knows that John is love. But you go back and you begin to look at John, and do you remember what John and James said when they were going down to Jerusalem? They tried to go through Samaria, and Samaria hated the Jews down at Jerusalem, and they wouldn't let them go. You remember what James and John said? They turned, Lord, you want us to call fire out of heaven and just kill all these people? No, don't do that. Who said that? John, the apostle of love. So let me ask you a question. Was there any change in John and his personality between the time that he wanted to kill all these Samaritans and the time he wrote those books about that great love? Yeah. And so here's a man that had that, and he changed, and boy, he could really then understand what love is all about, because apparently he didn't have a whole lot of it when he started out, when the Lord called him. So you begin to look. Oh, another one is Judas. Judas, wow. he's always a enigma to us, isn't it? Why him? And so comes in there, and we begin to get a little feedback about Judas, of what he was. And when we come to that situation where he didn't want this woman, to break that ointment and pour it on Jesus, and he acted like he wanted to give it to the poor. And then it said, but he didn't care for the poor. He wanted it in the bag, in the treasury, for what purpose? He had been taking it out. He was a thief from the beginning. He'd been stealing all the time. And the Lord called him to be one of the 12 apostles, a guy that had been stealing all the time? Yeah. Now, did the Lord make a thief out of him? No. No, the Lord didn't make a thief out of him. Did the Lord make a crude, harsh man out of Peter? No, he took a crude, harsh man and he made a rock. Did the Lord make a killer out of John? No, he took that kind of guy and he made a man of love. Now, did Jesus make a thief out of Judas? No. He called him, he was a thief. And the Lord did a lot for Judas. You stop to think what the Lord did for Judas to try to turn him around. In there. Now, Lord gave him the treasure, didn't he? Now, if you had 12 men following you, would you give the guy you know is a thief, would you let him be your treasurer? And you know he's been stealing money out there all the time? Just raise your hand if you say, oh yeah, that's the way I'd handle it. No. But you give it to him. Show him, I've got some confidence in you here. If there's anything to work on his conscience, you do this. Then you come up, and Jesus then had told him at a supper, he said, now one of you is going to betray me. And they all looking around, well, is it I? Is it I? Judas looked at him and said, surely not me. And he said, you said it. And just left it that way. Yeah. How do you suppose that would work on Steve? If I made a comment here tonight that somebody in here is going to betray me here, you're going to turn your back on me. And some of you say, well, is it I? Is it I? Steve comes up to me and said, Lowell, is it I? And I said, you said it, buddy. Turn around. How would Steve think? Steve knows I know. Now, if he really has a conscience, what's he going to do? He's already got his plans made out to betray Jesus, see. So then at the table, they were sitting around, and they were eating, and they ask again, Lord, who is it? Who is it? He said, it's the one that puts his hand in the sop for me, with me. Now that doesn't make too much sense to us in this generation. Helen, what's that stuff that you serve cheese when you melt your cheese? And fondue. If Jesus had said it's one who puts his hand in the fondue with me, you'd understand. You take a piece of bread, stick it in the fondue, and eat it. Take another piece of bread. That's what sop was, only it wasn't melted cheese. It was a soup. It was a soup. So it was a big bowl of soup, of type soup, out on the table, and the way they'd eat it is they'd break off a piece of bread, in there, now they'd eat it. Break off another piece of bread, there. And they called it sop in there. And so he said, it's the one that puts his hand in the sop with me. And here it is. Jesus and Judas both had their hands in the sop. You think Judas knew that Jesus knew what was going on? Then he looked up at him and he said, whatever you're going to do, do it now. Judas jumped up, went out, and betrayed him. But when he looked at him and said, whatever you're going to do, do it now. Was that putting pressure on Judas? I know who you are, Judas. I know what you're going to do. I've identified you 2 times. Now you make up your mind. What kind of person are you going to be? Make it up right now. Are you with me or are you against me? That's what that means. Jesus did everything he could do to Judas to try to turn his heart to be the kind of person that he ought to be. It worked with Peter. It worked with John. We have Matthew the tax collector. I don't know anything about Matthew. So I can't tell you, there's nothing in there about his character. But obviously he was a bookkeeper, he was a meticulous fellow, and so forth. And here we have these others, but the whole point that I'm getting at is, Jesus called his apostles, and he used these men. And I want us to see how he developed these men. I want us to see how he took the raw material out of these 12. None of them worth much. In Acts 2, aren't these just Galileans? Looked down upon, smeared upon. Yeah, they're just Galileans. Later on, why are they acting this way? Because they've been with Jesus. I want us to see what Jesus did to their lives. And of course, that's what we're dealing with, just with Peter. So, Peter was an apostle. Now, I put "an" in italics there. There is no word for "an" in Greek. He just apostle. He just a apostle is what you would say. We would say an apostle. He's just an apostle. He doesn't use the definite article. He's not using I am the apostle. Neither Paul or Peter, either one, used that definite article. That I am the apostle. Peter says, I'm just an apostle. Now the interesting thing is, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, you have the list of the 12 apostles given. And in each one of those lists, Peter's name is first. That's interesting. But he's never mentioned in any way as given a rank of superiority. Never in any way. But his name is there, which I think we would have to say shows he was prominent. But I expect he would be. Who would be the most prominent in a group of 12 men who anytime a question was asked, he's the first one to give the answer? Anytime that you're out and something's happening, he's the first one to make the mistake. He's the first one to get rebuked from Christ. He's the first one to stand forth. He's the first one to do all of this out of all these men. See? When you think of those 12 men, you'd probably think, well, let's start with Peter and work our way down, you see. But at no time is he given any superiority or anything really of that nature. Okay, tonight we've got down in the epistle of 1 Peter to the word Peter, an apostle. Not quite done with the book yet, so we'll see you next week and we'll continue on with our text. Thank you.